Welcome to the next part on Unit 7. On this part, we're going to be talking about sort of both a discussion of pr perspective in general, but also about how to make space and sort of like the design principle of the illusion of space. And we're talking about this in part because in the in this unit we've been talking about the 17th century art. We've been talking about printmaking, and as we were talking about printmaking, there were a number of images that kind of popped up relating to perspective, and so it's as good a place as any, really. And so some of the main points about this lecture will be, first of all, that perspective systems are not the only ways to make space, but then also we're going to be talking about the different kinds of perspective systems, the differences between isometric perspective systems and linear perspective systems, and then the different types of linear perspective. Okay, so like I said, we've been looking at a good deal of printmaking, and so perspective has kind of come up as an issue. Here's an example from Dürer about people learning the study of perspective and learning how perspective relates to the foreshortening of an object. Art can be quite scientific. So, but before we get there, we should talk about how do you create space in a work of art, because perspective is not the only way, and so we're just going to lay out some of the simplest ways, the most obvious and simple way in a work of art to create the illusion of space. And we're talking about in two-dimensional art generally, because in a three-dimensional work of art you don't have to create space, you already have it, right? But in a two-dimensional work you're creating the illusion of space if you want to, and one of the ways to do that is through overlap. So simply just saying this, just making this contour in front of that contour, you can say, aha, there's space. Or through shading or modeling, right? Changes of value, right? Therefore imply that an object has volume, and therefore if it has any volume, it has space. Placement on the page. This is a really good example of that. They feel quite clearly like they're going back in space, but if you really examine them, it's not like they're changing in scale much at all. But scale change can make a huge difference. Right? And although this implies that there's a perspective system involved, there is no perspective system. As well, and we've talked before about value and how that can, and also line weight, and how those things can create space, as well as the softness of edge or the crispness of edge. Another thing added to this could be detail, like the amount of detail or the less amount of detail. And then lastly, perspective systems. So here's a good example of a work of art that, although obviously Edgar Degas, firmly understood perspective systems, and you can see that in places he's showing that he understands it quite well. On the whole, the illusion of space in this work does not rest on perspective system at all. It is purely based on the things that we were talking about in terms of overlap and scale, right? Scale differences sometimes can, and placement, but mostly about overlap, right? As well as color and value can also be a major part. So a lot of what we see in a lot of art before the 14th centuries, we see a lot of art that is attempting to figure out complicated spaces, and one of the ways to do that would be to do it in an isometric system. And there are lots of cultures that you could point to where narratives were drawn and painted in isometric systems. You can tell when you're looking at an isometric system because the rule for an isometric system is if the lines are supposed to be parallel, then they are described as exactly parallel in the work of art. So if this is a box, right, and if these are supposed to be in real life parallel to each other, then they need to be described as parallel to each other in the work of art as well. I often tell my drawing students that they should think about isometric perspective as being loyal to the thing versus linear perspective being loyal to the way we see the thing, because those two things are not really the same. Such as, I also say that isometric perspective is actually more truthful. Like if you had a cube in front of you and it was exactly, 10 inches tall and 10 inches in this distance, right? An isometric drawing of that cube is more truthful to that fact because you can take those 10 inches and you can make them into 3 inches, but besides that scale change, the drawing can be exactly the same as the box, right? Every length can be those 3 inches. Whereas in linear perspectives, and I don't like the way in this diagram they say perspective and isometric, because they're both forms of perspective. In linear perspective, right, you notice things like diminishing, right, and convergence, that lines converge on each other, and you notice that lengths get smaller the further away they go from you. Because that is true, that's the way we perceive. So this is truthful to how we see the world, but this is truthful to the thing or to the world, right? Isometric drawings can be very useful in schematic drawings, such as this drawing here, this architectural drawing. It's also useful sometimes in games, although less so now because so many games are first person. Okay, so that's isometric perspective, but then we have two different types of a linear perspective. The simplest form, and there are actually more than that, but let's start with the first two. The simplest type of perspective is what's called a one-point perspective system. In a one-point perspective system, you have eye level line, which sometimes is the same thing as your horizon line, but not always. You have an eye level line, and then you have a vanishing point on that eye level line. And then all the diagonals, everything that is going back in space is diagonal going to that one vanishing point. Everything else needs to be either a perfect vertical or a perfect horizontal. And if you follow those rules, you can draw almost anything in perfect one-point perspective. So here's another example of that. There's a vanishing point. There's the eye level line. These are called vanishing lines, right? These kind of trace lines that take this diagonal all the way to the vanishing point to make sure that it matches up. Okay. Whereas in two-point perspective, you have two different vanishing points. Two-point perspective is really very useful for drawing objects when they're not perfectly lined up to you. Like one-point perspective is great for objects that are lined up so that they're flat to you, so that those horizontals are straight horizontal. It's also pretty good for drawing objects if they're at exactly a 45-degree angle to you. But when objects shift off of 45 degrees on either side, then two-point perspective is a much more useful device. It's more flexible for different kinds of points of view. So here's a famous example that we've seen a number of times already. We talked about this when we talked about the career of Raphael, and we talked about this when we talked about fresco painting, which was a little bit before then, I think. But it's also a really good example of one-point perspective. Whether this box here is in two-point perspective or whether it actually fits in one-point perspective may be up for debate. But everything else, pretty much, as far as I can tell, is in one-point perspective, all going to a single vanishing point. And you can see how beautifully that one-point perspective system creates space. When it's done well, you don't think of it as systematic, you just think of it as space, and it's very effective. Here's another example of an artist using a one-point perspective system. And so Akins here was trying to understand the perspective structure of waves, which really says a lot about the kind of artist Thomas Akins was, that he was so obsessed with getting things that precisely right. He didn't want to just paint the waves roughly right. He wanted to make sure that they were painted in perspective, that they were diminishing, getting smaller in the right system. So here's another artist who's using perspective, kind of a play on one-point and two-point perspective. So here we have Ed Ruscha, that is a more kind of modern contemporary play on one-point perspective or two-point perspective. And here's some other contemporary artists. Carla Klein is a favorite of mine. Her work is often quite not dependent, but it's like a using and playing with perspective systems. These are gorgeous. And Julie Mehretu, who I love her work, and her work is very much At first, it's kind of hard to see the structure, but you can really see the